So let's go ahead and talk about the 18th century. In the 18th century, the main feature of the 18th century is this idea of the Enlightenment. It is the idea of experimentation, of trying stuff. This is the heroic era of medicine. This is when people are expanding their thought, expanding their consciousness. They are fighting for the rights of man, which we'll see in the land of revolutions that are coming up. We're going to see sort of people really, philosophers really taking a hard look and really putting pressure on their governments and on their fellows to stand up and kind of take control of their thought, of what they're doing and how they're thinking. Sort of the birth of how we think today, or a modern thought, kind of started in this time period. As I'm sure you saw in your philosophy classes, in your religion classes, a lot of the philosophers that we talk about now came from this time period. And big theories about education came in this time period. So you can blame the 18th and 19th century, or celebrate the 18th and 19th century for what you're going through now. This is one of my favorite images. This is a print of a balloon gone badly, a ballooning gone badly. And I just think it's spectacular that it's this, a balloon flight is a spectator sport as it is now. And the person decided to capture the worst of the balloonery, not necessarily the best of the balloonery. And it's kind of like what we do today with our cell phones, that we take pictures of the worst, not necessarily the best. Let's take a little look at our map of Europe in the 1700s, at 1700. So we're seeing Spain is kind of here, but you notice that Spain controls part of Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, Majorca, Ibiza, and its own realm as we know it today. The kind of very very hotly contested area between France and Spain has shifted back down for France. Portugal's about the same. Africa seems to be, it might just be the weakness of this map, but I think it's probably still a bit of the Ottoman Empire, or they've gone Spanish. We see the Ottoman Empire has shrunk a good bit. It used to be a big chunk of Austria and Hungary here, but now it has shrunk a little bit more. And the Ottoman Empire sticks around for a fairly long bit of time. The Habsburg dynasty has become more powerful. The Holy Roman Empire is still existing, but again, it is sort of this weird, it doesn't affect our clothing history very much. Probably not until we get into the 20th century. France is shifted this way. It usually is a little more this way. And England is unified at this time period. And this sort of map sticks a little bit. We'll see some wars, but it sticks a little bit. The wars that we're going to see are going to be internal wars. They're going to be revolutionary wars. So a little bit of overview of the age. This was the age of enlightenment. Philosophy challenged everything. Philosophy challenged the ideas of authority, the ideas of government, the ideas of political power. We're starting to think about political theory a little bit more. And this great idea that that the scientific method, and remember we talked about a smidge, we looked at the dude that came up with the scientific method yesterday, that the scientific method can be used to solve not only scientific problems, but also political problems and social problems. And this idea will continue on into the 19th century and a little today. That if you use the scientific method to solve poverty, use the scientific method to solve hunger, use the scientific method to solve crime, that these social ills are being challenged by the scientific method, an empirical method. the yoke, I love this phrase, the yoke of tradition was thrown off by new waves of thinking. We didn't have to have a monarch just because we've always had a monarch. We didn't have to. We didn't have to have slavery just because we've always had slavery. And we're starting to see the antecedents of the abolitionist movement that we're going to talk about a good schmidge in the 19th century. We're going to see we see women's rights start a tiny bit creep to the forefront and then go back. But soon, pretty soon, in the next week, we're going to start to see the rights of women come back. This is from Diderot's Encyclopedia. If you know something, if there is something you know, communicate it. If there's something you don't know, search for it. I should get that tattooed on my face because that's kind of what we do for a living. This is a wonderful painting that is demonstrating the power of a vacuum. So we have a vacuum pump here, and the dove is going to be killed by a vacuum. And here is our philosopher scientist. We're going to talk about it in a second, but you'll notice he's wearing a banyan. He's wearing his home clothing, his home robe. The rest of the people are guests all the way around here, but he is the philosopher science inside. And you'll notice that the two little girls are kind of really upset about the dead bird, that they've killed the bird. I'm a little upset that they killed the bird back in the day. But this is sort of like, so science was not just in laboratories. Science was happening in the parlor. Science was entertainment. So there were, we talked yesterday about this idea of the societies. So what happened in these societies is that you would discover something, and then you would go in front of the French Academy, or you would go in front of the English societies, scientific societies, and you would present it, and you would be argued with, and you would have a dissenting view. And it was this wonderful sort of height of intellectualism, that if you were smart, you were really, really popular and you could get money. Also, if you were political, but it's a complicated, human beings are complicated, so it's a complicated system. But this sort of science being entertainment was a big part of it as well. Scholars and scientists wanted to understand the natural world and humankind's place solely in it. Reason was all. The ability to be a thinking human being was the most important. And again, this sort of ideas about science illuminating humanity, and children being part of it as well, that they weren't necessarily shunted away and taught by tutors, but that they're part of it as well. And we see in this one that it is women, even though the two little poor girls, that is, women are being allowed to be part of it as well. This search spurred conflict between religion and the inquiring mind, but religion did not have armies anymore. So they couldn't kill people. These sort of intellectual societies were being supported by the monarchy as well. So that you could get money from the king for discovering stuff. That we have this idea of the royal society, so that the monarchy, and this happened a lot in England, we see it a bit in France, that the monarchy was giving money, supporting scientists and in their pursuits. And it was always the search for evidence and proof. Like I said before, solving practical problems. So the ordinary people's lives began to improve. There was fewer rural people died, less property was destroyed in wars, advances in agriculture, advances in irrigation. And that is kind of the interesting thing at this time period, is that it wasn't just that the philosophers and scientists were looking at the big questions. They were also looking at the tiny questions as well. A great example is Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin was this wonderful natural philosopher and scientist, but he made glasses. He made a stove. He talked about the weather. It wasn't just these huge these huge questions of life and death and God that we saw in the 17th century, we're also seeing the questions about how do I make my life better? How do I mechanize this? How do I make this job faster? We see, we're going to talk about this in a second, but we see the birth of the Industrial Revolution as well. The ideas of germ theory, the ideas of medicine, the ideas of how do I make our lives better and cleaner and more pleasant? And the other neat thing that's part of this is that we see in artists that they're not just, okay, they're still super duper painting and making etchings and drawings of the nobility, because that's where the cash is. But we also see the regular lower class become the subject for artists, and not just as, like we saw for the past 2,000, 20,000 years, not just as, what's that called? Not just as servants or as background characters, but the central figures as well. And we see that in this picture here, as we see street urchins, kind of like ravening boys running around, and we see carts moving. We see this is a car accident, it looks like, that she's like, you ran into me, oh, what the hell? And the guy is filling the lanterns out there, and there's lightning in the background for some reason. I don't know, I think it's just an exciting picture. The Enlightenment brought this kind of idea of needing to codify information to, and we've seen this a couple times where there's very educated men running around, that they wanted to make sure everybody knew the same thing, a normalization of information. Of course, it's partially this sort of social conscience, but also this sort of egotism that I know better, so I'm going to make sure everybody thinks the same as me. So we see the first encyclopedia, the Encyclopédie, created by Denis Diderot. His aim was to change the way people think, and he wanted to incorporate every bit of knowledge that existed and then ship it out to other people. This was for everyone. This had this great idea of equalization, that everyone is made equal. And remember that, because, well, you should remember it, because we talk about it a lot in our American history classes, this idea of being of equality, the birth of equality. This idea of democratic learning was of democracy in general, was the culmination of the age, was kind of why, the height of the 18th century was democracy. Everyone was created equal as long as you were white, male, and property owners. And there was the best part about this idea of democracy was not that it was a God-given right, even though they put that language in, but that your rights, your inalienable human rights, was because you were human. And this is kind of the seed for lots of revolutions that we see later in the 18th century and into the 19th century, of people throwing off the yoke of being slaves. That if we are all created equal, then slaves, then people who were made slaves are equal. This also comes in the early 20th century, when we start talking about the equal rights of women. That it is not because we are God says that we're equal. It's because we're equal because we're human. We see the Enlightenment affects so much of the modern governmental systems. The American Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. So much of this idea, these ideas of equality, these ideas of humanity, these ideas of democracy, finds its way into our governmental systems, or how people were considering governments, how people were considering justice, how people were considering systems in place that makes sure that people were created or treated equally as far as human beings can do such a thing. This is also the age of the philosophers. Not since ancient Greece has the philosophers kind of had this stuff happening. The philosophers criticized the church, they criticized the government, they criticized the ancien regime of the nobility, and they went to jail, and they were happy to do so because of their revolutionary theories. One of my favorite theories is that to be nobility is no more than an accident of birth. And boy howdy, yes. And this was so revolutionary because, when you're in a society, it's really hard to kind of get yourself out of a society or separate yourself from what is going on around you. But this revolutionary idea that because you're noble, it's no more than because you were born to the right parents. It wasn't that you were inherently smarter, you weren't inherently better, you didn't have gold blood or purple blood running through your veins. You were as human as the next person. You were exactly the same. And this idea of equality is marvelous. It's, we sort of take it a little bit for granted, that this is the birth right here. These philosophers birthed the American dream, and it's marvelous. All right, so let's take a second to talk a little bit about royalty. Now, royalty were still in power at this time throughout most of Europe. We see various amounts, so the sort of balance between the Georges and the Parliament in England, the balance between the Louis in France and the rest of the nobility. They didn't really have a parliament at this time. And so various and sundry leadership, generally monarchies, was happening at this time. But it was going badly. And one of the main reasons it was going badly is that they wanted to keep power in the families. So there was like 4 major families in Europe, and they interbred. This caused large swaths of the monarchs, remember, divine right of kings, to be born imbeciles, to be born barely functional. And this weakening of the monarchy, and if you take a look at our book talks a little bit about Louis XVI. If you take a look at the difference between Louis XIV and Louis XVI, there's a pretty big difference between the two. So we're seeing the monarchy kind of weakening from within. The picture that we're seeing here is Charles II of Spain. And this is his chin. This is called the Habsburg chin. And if you remember the map, we have Habsburg, Austria, and that was one of the major families. He had this sort of protruding chin, a jutting forehead, and he did not have mental facilities to run a country, let alone take care of himself. He was unable to take care of himself. And here is the ancestry of King Charles II of Spain. And you'll notice here, cousins are marrying, and nieces and nephews are marrying uncles here. We're seeing that we see Hungary and Bavaria and Rome, Burgundy, Denmark, Lorraine. So we're seeing this is a lot of what's going on in Germany. But you'll notice that they're all interrelated. They all come from Philip of Castile and Joanna of Castile. And this caused what we see here. If you ever want an adventure, go onto Wikipedia and look up what his ailments were, just from this sort of insane interbreeding. But royalty was still the major setter of styles and fashion, especially in France. And France was the major setter of world styles. And this was true throughout most of the 18th century, and a good bit of the a chunk of the 19th century as well. And this is especially true with Madame de Pompadour. She was the mistress of Louis the 16th, and she was sort of magnificent. She was a patron of the arts. She was the patron of philosophers. She was the patron of musicians. You'll notice that in her two portraits here, she's reading music in this one, and she's playing an instrument in this one. And remember what we said a couple classes ago, that often people would get painted with the things that they want to be remembered by. Remember those two outside the windows of that one portrait of King Henry VIII, that it was war and peace in the background. So she was very much part of the moving and shaking in France at the time, and she advised the king. The king was pretty ineffectual. He wasn't succeeding in a lot of things, but he was able to listen to her. Hang on. I forgot my notes on the other side of the room. I had to grab them. Normally I would pause it and then restart, but nope. Yeah, it was, the 15th, Louis the 15th. Louis the 16th is Marie Antoinette. So she was sort of fantastic, and very much set the style for France at this time, and for Europe. So some of the philosophers that I'm sure you guys have run into these: Voltaire, Rousseau, Hume, and Montesquieu. Our major scientists were Halley, remember Halley's Comet, Benjamin Franklin, and Bernoulli. Our major authors were Defoe, Daniel Defoe. I almost said Willem Dafoe. That's not it. Pope, Alexander Pope. For those of you who have spent any amount of time, Alexander Pope is a poet of the 18th century. Jonathan Swift, and you'll notice that Defoe was writing adventure stories. Pope and Swift were writing satires. So again, we're seeing the sort of schizophrenia of the world. Composers were Bach, Handel, and Mozart. If you guys are taking the time to search for movies, watch Amadeus. It's on Netflix. It's spectacular. It is one of my favorite movies. It's pretty great. And it shows this sort of Austrian nobility and the Austrian court life very, very realistically. And it's pretty spectacular. I think you would dig the hell out of it. And it's kind of sexy. The other interesting thing that's happening in France at this time is that, so in France it was illegal to speak out against the church. It was illegal to speak out against the monarchy. A lot of philosophers and writers of the time spent time in jail. They would write something, they would publish it, and they would get snapped up and put into the Bastille for however many weeks until somebody can pay their way out. So they kind of turned to salons, and the salon system was sort of spectacular. So it was kind of almost like a cocktail party, but they would listen to, so people would bring their poems, people would bring their scientific writings, and they would say them out loud, and then people would talk about them. And it was one way to sort of disseminate this sort of criticism safely. It was also another way for women to take part in the intellectual life of the world. Women, again, were not seen as very powerful. They didn't have sovereignty over their own stuff. But if they had salons, if they were wealthy, they were nobility, and they held salons, they could be seen as equals. And this is Madame Geoffrin was one, and that's her right here. And the main purpose of the salon was to spread knowledge. We also see, speaking of spreading knowledge, this is also the age of revolution. The philosophy of enlightenment caused people to question the government, caused people to question the status quo, which is always a good thing to do. You should always question the status quo. It's status quo because it is status. So always question. That's my service announcement for the day. But this sort of philosophy, this widespread pamphleteering, caused people to be able to read and question their governments. And it inspired people to take control of their government. So we saw revolutions. The right of personal liberty was established in England in the 1760s, including freedom from arrest for political reasons and without due process. And we see the revolution in France and the revolution in America being part of this as well, these gaining freedoms for the individual. In France, there were spirited talks about the rights of man and freedom, but there was really no way to do it. There was no redress for the common populace. They couldn't go to their congressmen and complain. They couldn't get together a petition. If you got together a petition, you were probably going to spend some time in jail. So the government in France kind of froze the social construct, the court etiquette, how things were done, who was in charge, sort of froze itself to copy the forms of life from the Louis XIV's time, and there was no change. It stopped. And so there was nothing that the populace could do except go to war. If you've ever gone to see Les Mis. In the American colonies, the kind of weight of the British rule, we're starting to see an influx of philosophers. French thought is coming over to America, this sort of freedom, and the writers from France and American thinkers are going over to France and learning. And they wanted free trade. Essentially, any revolution generally comes down to either religion or money, and sometimes it's the same thing. The French, so we had the American Revolution, so the French quickly followed. It was way different than the American Revolution because the American Revolution was kind of, if we boil it down to its essentials, which is always troublesome, it's about freedom from British rule, basically. We were trying to overthrow British rule. And Britain was far away. We generally weren't fighting our own people. We had some loyalists that got killed, but it was not really brother versus brother. We'll have that in another century, don't you worry. But in France, it was very much a fight about, it was very much violent. It was very much unpredictable. That once Madame Guillotine started chopping off heads, it was really difficult for them to stop that. And even the Directoire, the sort of mini parliament-esque that was set up, they even went against themselves. They kind of, if you disagree with them, the exact same thing that happened before, they would kill you. So by the end of this whole kerfluffle in France, Napoleon was emperor, the absolute dictator, and he crowned himself emperor in 1804, I think. And revolution, we see revolution and war lasted until 1815 in Europe and most of the world. So we don't just have a governmental revolution across Europe and America. We're also seeing an industrial revolution. And I know we kind of see the industrial revolution of sticking to the 19th century, but it really started in the late 18th century. And it sort of was the culmination of this sort of scientific ideal of people tinkering with the world. The first thing that really led to the industrial explosion, the mechanization explosion, was the invention of the steam engine. This sort of need, and here is a diagram of it, this sort of need for mechanical power. And before that, we had some power sources. We had the water wheel, which drove a lot of mechanization. We had horsepower, we had dog power, we had human power, but we never really had a consistent, cheap, that's the key, source of power that, all you needed to do was heat water, and you basically had a really easy power source. And the first one, you'll notice down here that the first one that was installed is in 1785. So it's relatively early. The other thing that kind of helped lead to the Industrial Revolution was this thing called the Bessemer technique, and it was a way to make steel to make steel less brittle. So normal open pit steel smelting, your steel would cool at different rates, and it made it brittle. So what the Bessemer, and this is a Scottish that the Americans stole, is a Scottish innovation that the Americans stole. What the Bessemer technique did is that it added oxygen to burn off impurities. And once these impurities were burnt off, it allowed that steel to cool evenly, to cool better, and you were getting a purer product. And that meant you could make more faster, and it was simply adding oxygen to it. But I digress, as I do. So the spinning jenny was invented in 1767 because, we had the power loom. We were looming faster. We were making cloth faster, but spinning was still took a pretty long time. So what they needed to find a way to make spinning faster, and it is this right here, this picture right here. So you'll notice it's hand cranked, and it spins like dozens of wool, dozens of spindles, bobbins of thread at the same time, of yarn at the same time, and that was a fantastic innovation. We also see the invention of the cotton gin, the power loom, the knitting machine, and also innovations in dyeing and fabric printing, making more color fast, finer prints, more colors. We're going to see the birth of chemical dyes here shortly. And cheap iron and steel fundamentally changed how we lived, how we spent our time, and the whole fashion industry. Economics switched so quickly at this time once the Industrial Revolution kind of got going. So here's three videos for you guys to watch. This one's the spinning jenny. Turn on the sound because it's a little annoying. It is a student's commercial for the spinning jenny, but he has some good information in it. It's worth a watch, but just turn down the sound because they're a little loud. This is a hand cotton gin to kind of show you what the cotton gin looks like, and then a power loom, an early power loom. So hand in hand with the Industrial Revolution came the Commercial Revolution. So we've been seeing this for the past couple centuries, that wealth is trickling out of the aristocracy and into the hands of regular people, into merchants and stuff. Wealth was not the stamp of hereditary rank, that it was not given that if you were a duke that you would be wealthy. And we will super duper see this change at the end of the 19th century. Materials and goods became inexpensive. and luxury items became more widely available. We also see how people shopped, how people looked at goods, and how merchants were showing their goods to the populace changed a whole bunch. This was another area of revolution. One of the first ones was fantastic, were these fashion dolls. And they also did cardboard dolls. I don't know if you guys ever saw these when you were kids, that you would get the doll, the paper doll in her underwear, and then you would cut out the clothing and just switch the clothing. So not only were these a toy, and they were dressed in the fashions of the day, but also this was a training for the next generation of consumers. Kind of like what we do today with commercials during children's shows. Is they're not only entertaining, but they're also training consumers that buying is good. So these are the dolls, and these are the paper dolls. So you'll notice it is a person in her petticoat and corset, and then there's a whole bunch of other outfits that you can put over top of it. Isn't that spectacular? We also see the invention of the fashion magazine as we know it. So the fashion magazine is almost exactly what we know today. So it was advertisements, it was the pictures of the latest. A lot of people who did etchings or these simple drawings would be part of the staff of this fashion magazine. And they would even include patterns to make clothes at home. And this happened quite up to about the 60s, whenever patterns started to fall out of fashion magazines. There was also the fashion plate, which was the color drawing of the latest. And these would either be in a book, or you could order them, or a tailor would have these on hand so that you could say, hey, I want this. I want that he could show, he or she could show what these things were, what the latest fashions were, and you could just go, oh yeah, can I have that in purple? Wedgwood opened his ceramics factory. This is another big shift in consumer goods. This is the idea of lines. If you took a look at the modern influence section at the end of all of the PowerPoint so far, you'll notice that I have at the very bottom, I caption it with the designer or the designer's house and a date. And that's the idea of lines. So this idea of perennially changing what you're selling came from Wedgwood. So Wedgwood was a ceramics company in 1760. It was in England, and they were really, really good at ceramics and porcelain. I mean, we still talk about Wedgwood porcelain today, and it's still being sold today. But they were also really good at selling the brand, making the brand. His people understood what the bourgeoisie wanted. They wanted to keep up with the neighbors. They wanted to surpass their neighbors. They wanted to be the people above them. So they kept up with the latest trends and tailored their designs accordingly. So they would, and not only would they just have new lines, they would make it in an invited event, kind of like fashion shows today, kind of like car shows today, kind of like the toy show in Las Vegas, or E3 for those of you who are into computers and gaming, kind of like E3, this sort of perennial new line. The wealthy and influential elite were invited to attend these openings, and this was a public relations cash cow. The fashions in apparel, home furnishing, and accessories started to change every year, and the designers were bowing to the idea that their consumers wanted new. Because we're starting to see disposable income, we're starting to see more leisure. These people have time on their hands, and the social life of the populace of the bourgeoisie is becoming really, really, really important. There is a communal competition for being better, and this will certainly become highly important in the next chapter in the 19th century. One of the really interesting interesting aspects of this new consumerism is Chippendale and Hepplewhite. Chippendale and Hepplewhite. I'm sure you've heard of Chippendale furniture before. Not the dancers. They're not Chippendale dancers at this time period because yuck. But they're Chippendale and Hepplewhite were furniture designers. And what they would do is they would publish a catalog and send it to their consumers. And this is probably the first time that we actually see a catalog. So every year you would, or every season, they would send you the latest chair legs, or send you a book that details what they're offering this year. So what is the change of the armoire? How different is our dressers? Look, we got this new style in and we're gonna use it. And they also, just like with Wedgwood, they also kind of used a lot of Asian styles in their designs as well. So we'll see if you take a look at Chippendale and Hepplewhite's that there is a line that is bamboo. They have bamboo styling. They have Shinizawi or Indian fabrics. So we're seeing that they are not only using traditional Western European forms, but also sort of Asian forms that are really becoming apparent in this time period. Fads came and went, and this was also the time of people started to take vacations. People started to be tourists. People started to want to remember things that are happening and keep mementos. So, for example, the World's Fair. The World's Fair would happen, and people would want a commemorative plate, or they would want a commemorative ribbon that remembered the first balloon flight, or the excavation of the Herculaneum, or the royal marriage. And merchants would sell trinkets. We have this today. When I first did this lecture, they had just gotten married, and you could buy a plate with Catherine and Kate Middleton and Prince William, face on things. Or a Pez dispenser. I love the Pez dispenser. And this has been true since the 18th century, this sort of idea of commemoration, that we need an outside thing to remember. The other part of this is, you would invite your neighbors over, and they would see this commemorative portrait of the first balloon flight, and you could say, oh yes, I was there. This sort of presence through things, that you can prove your presence at an event through your objects that you collect. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the general clothing outline. Just like with the sort of furniture lines and pottery lines and commemorative things, it was constantly shifting. We're seeing more exotic patterns, more exotic fabrics. And Europe is taking these processes and making them their own. Materials became cheaper and cheaper, mostly because of mechanization. If you have a mechanized loom, you don't have to pay 4 people to run it. You pay 1 person to run it. So, labor costs went down, prices for the goods went down. It was relatively safe to move about the world, We also see the cult of the new that I just talked about, this idea that if I don't have the latest chair, if I don't have the latest iPhone, my friends will look down on me. They won't think I am hip anymore. It's nothing new under the sun. France was still stylistically influential. A lot of what we're seeing in styles came from France first for most of the 18th century. And the fashionable world followed France. Um, so the main style that we see at this period is called Rococo. And Rococo style is really delicate, very light, airy, asymmetrical. We talked about asymmetry last year. Oh my God, yesterday. And ornamentation. There's lots of ornamentation, and it's not necessarily the super heavy, gaudy stuff we saw in the late Renaissance and part of the Baroque. We're seeing sort of the decoration is very playful. It's very light. It's very graceful. So the Baroque gracefulness is continuing. It's very soft and round. Rococo motifs, like we see in this painting here, kind of focused on the aristocracy, the fun of the nobility, and this sort of carefreeness. We had just been through a war. We'd just been through wars, so carefree is the name of the game right now. During the Rococo. And it was very romantic. So this is when the kind of artistic ideal of romance started to be apparent. Remember the courtly rules? We're starting to see that again, that sort of come back up, return into the vernacular. So this is another portrait of Madame de Pompadour. And she is what we call dishabillée, which is sort of partially dressed in kind of careless manner. It's sort of, I just threw this together, but it took me 17 hours to do it. This is kind of the quintessential Rococo outfit. Very delicate, very soft, lots of lace, lots of bows, really overly decorated with ruffles and roses and frills and ruching. So this, remember we talked about ruching before, so this is ruching, kind of manipulating fabric into piles, lace and ribbon and bows. So this is Rococo right here in a portrait. And after a while, towards the later part of the 1600s, we start to see neoclassicism come back because there was an explorer in Greece who uncovered, or in Italy, who uncovered Pompeii and uncovered the Herculaneum, and they were these cities that were preserved by lava flows, were preserved by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And so it kind of re-inspired this idea of neoclassicism. We're going to talk about neoclassicism a smidge, but it's mostly an early 19th century effect, early 19th century style, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. So clothing was made for well-to-do men and women by tailors and servants. But after rich people just had their clothes made by dress designers or dressmakers, a women's dressmaker was called a mantua maker after the mantua. Remember that from yesterday. She would work out of her shop or her client's home. Marie Antoinette, I think there's a picture of it in the book. She had this sort of workforce. Oh no, it's in the YouTube video. She had this sort of workforce of mantua makers that she hired, and it wasn't that they just sat around and sewed all day. They were the dictators. They helped her dictate style. They were wig makers and hat makers and shoemakers, and it was this wonderful female forward concern, female forward business concern. Some spent a day or up to a week at the client's residence, making or altering their clothes for the entire family. So they would go in and they would just work on the clothes for a week or so for a season. So if you had, we need a new suit of clothes for the whole family for summer, she would come in and she would just sew for the week and fit as necessary. So for a family with limited means, they had to do the providing clothing was still a housewife's job. They could get some ready-mades for the family, but often it was her job to kind of create, repair, patch, and keep them all together. Corsets were made by men. Hello, that doesn't sound smart. And you notice in this portrait here that it is not just the mother, the mistress of the house. It's also her daughters. Her daughters were often dragooned into being part of this sort of a manufactory. More specialty jobs came into being in the 18th century. I posted a video in the other sources about the diary of a haberdasher. And that is somebody who provides dry goods. So we had milliners, which are hat makers, glove makers, wig makers. And this is specialization because of the sort of diversity of objects and of styles and how fast the styles turned over. You just didn't have one person who did all of it. You had one person who did one very specific job. Makeup artists, cobblers, shoemakers. They all became their adept at their craft. We also see this as we also see self-promotion and marketing happen at this time as well. They would hang signs in their windows that, "Oh, the king shops here. You should shop here too." And this is that idea of wealthy endorsements, of lucrative endorsements from the wealthy. That, "Oh, Princess Anne bought my hat. You should buy my hat here." This happened whenever Kate and William got married, is that so everybody has to wear a hat to high social events in England. It's kind of the thing. And there was a couple of hat makers that were making sort of beautiful hat pieces. I think Pippa wore one. And so this hat maker had Pippa, the queen, the princess's sister, was wearing this specific hat maker. Therefore, we must wear this specific hat maker as well. We see this today, other ways today that, we have that project that I'm asking you to do is to look at the runways, look at the red carpets and see if there's something that matches in the past. And this happened as well so that we could see, oh my God, that dress is by Dolce & Gabbana. I need a gown for a gala. I'm going to go to Dolce & Gabbana. I'm not going to go. I would make it myself before going to Dolce & Gabbana. So here is a wig maker. This is the shop of a barber and a wig maker. And you'll notice that it is mostly men, a couple women working as well. So we're seeing a whole bunch of different things because wigs were really, really, really important at this time. So fabrics, great progress was made in the global textile trade during the 18th century. Mechanization really, really helped. The manufacture of cotton and wool fabrics. Techniques for dyeing and printing became faster and easier, not safer. And we'll talk about this in the 19th century. One of the best known printed fabrics was called toile de joie. This is sort of unbleached cotton that had pastoral scenes on this. And you can still buy this today. I actually have pillowcases with these patterns on it because this is kind of quintessentially Rococo. It is pastoral, it is pretty, it is romantic, it is sort of soft and curvy. And there's a whole bunch of different styles of this. So here's another one. And this is kind of how they printed fabric at the time. So here is a tile, a printing tile, a block. And this would have this whole scene on it. And the block would have this scene on it, and they would put fabric through this sort of printing press. And it was still relatively labor intensive. It's not as fast as sort of mechanized printing that we have today, but it was way faster than painting it by hand. And then the next section over would match these legs. So the next piece would be here. And it would just overlap, so you kind of knew where things were going. Toile de joie was manufactured using strong-toned, color-fast dyes and copper plates. Copper plates allowed us to have small details. And we would see shepherdesses and landscapes and floral patterns, architecture, little scenes. So this is a pastoral scene of a party. So they're dancing and drinking and playing a lute. And sometimes they would even have ones that are like leisure activities, like ballooning. I'm looking for ballooning toile. If anybody finds it, I want it. Another type of fabric that became very popular, again, just like for the past few centuries, we were sort of obsessed with Asia and the Near East. So chinoiserie is a decorative style based on Chinese art and decoration. Indienne is the same, but it is based on India. So, India chintz that we saw yesterday. Late 17th century, throughout the 18th century, a little bit of 19th century, we start to see Japanosui. Oh my God, these ones are killing me. Which is Japanese based, but Japanese was a closed society at this time. So we didn't get, and China was open, so we did not see Japanese influenced textiles and furnishings and stuff until the 19th century and 20th century when it opened. The craze for chinoiserie, see, I got it, necessitated the importation of satin, painted silk, as well as embroideries from the East. And then Europe, especially England, started to make their own. And this is Indienne, and you can kind of tell by this motif. And this is embroidered silk. And embroidery is stitching. So this is all decoration that is stitched in. And this is Pecan, so this is Chinese flavored. We see this decorative style in vases, tableware, furniture, decorations, and because we had to have the exotic, so we have this sort of Chinese lacquerware. This is a picture, big screens. And it wasn't that your whole room was Chinese inspired. It was, you would have a focal piece. So you would have a Persian rug. You would have, the spinet, the upright piano here is totally domestic. But then you would have this huge lacquer screen that just was your pride and joy. In clothing, we see Chinese prints, asymmetrical clothing styles, as well as unusual color combos, and unusual types of silk fabrics, including nankeen, which is a yellow cotton. We also have one of my favorite pieces of clothing is the banyan. And you remember from our book that there was three different types of, there was sort of distinctness about clothing and when you could wear where. So there was the dress, there was the underdress, undress, there was the dress and full dress. And it was about formality. So undressed was not naked like it is today. Undressed was house clothes. So you would wear your cravat, you would wear your slippers, you would wear your high heel slippers, you would wear your cravat, you would wear your breeches, you would wear your shirt with your waistcoat, but then you would throw this house robe on it. So this is called a banyan, and it's based on a Chinese robe, or we also would see something like a kimono. And this is what you would wear about the house. So you would come home and you would put on basically your bathrobe, and that's what you wore around the house. And then for dress and full dress, dress clothes were made with less decorative fabrics, so they were just everyday clothes. And then full dress was kind of your super duper decorated and satin, and whenever you had whenever you had formal occasions, you would wear your full dress. And women had the same sort of thing. So jewelry, pearls are still the thing. And we start to see some other gemstones as well. But jewelry, just like 17th century jewelry, was really understated, and it was used to show off the beauty of the person. So we see some examples of pearls, accent pieces. So usually when you wear jewels, you're pointing to a particular part of your body. So if you want to show off your face, you're going to wear something at your neck. If you want to show off something south of your face, you're going to put a decoration there. If you want to show off your very delicate hands, you're going to wear contrasting beads around your wrist, or you're going to wear, if you want to show off your face, put a big sparkly earring there, because the eye will go to the sparkly bit and then notice how beautiful you really are. Makeup and grooming, again, washing, they weren't doing it. Not very common practice. Instead, people wore makeup to conceal dirty skin. We still used lead. We still used mercury. We still used dangerous things to make ourselves beautiful. We're starting to see more colored cheeks. Still not coloring the eyes. We're still plucking the eyebrows and sort of soft lips. We want it's sort of like a natural beauty, an au naturel. People also believe that body odor could be disguised with perfume. Louis XV insisted his courtiers wore a different perfume every day. Thank God by the end of the century we start to care more about soap. Woo! So wigs and hair. Wigs were a big thing at this time. Everyone powdered their hair as an affectation, or they would wear a powdered wig. Women would spray wheat meal into their own hair to turn them white. Men also wore wheat meal, except they would have huge white wigs known as the full bottom wigs, and this is an example of one where it's super curly. The Remil's wig, Remillet's wig was also common. Wigs were made of horsehair, yak hair, goat hair, vegetable fibers, and human hair, the latter being the most expensive, just like today. So even something as simple as this, was a wig, and it had its own creation, and it was white generally. So Madame de Pompadour started a craze for super duper hair. It was this interesting moment that your dress was relatively in shape. It was not plain, but it was kind of graceful and beautiful and soft. And then you would have these huge headpieces, these huge hairstyles. And they would have these fanciful names. Of course, artists' conception of them are always go a little bit further because they're telling a good story. But they would have like butterflies and real-life birds in their cage. They would build a cage out of their hair and put a bird in it. They would put real flowers and jewels and branches, and there's ribbons with tassels and just a little bit of everything on up in there. It was all arranged in a towering wig. And this is, once again, this is probably a little bit of a satire here, but this is probably close to what people were looking at. That it was just sort of big, huge, bouffanty, and then it has feathers and flowers and a little mob cap back here. And this is the story of a wig here. Women weren't washing their hair once you got it done. Again, the birds getting stuck in the huge hair. Anytime there's a weird fashion trend, there's always going to be somebody complaining about it. The tall accoutrements called posture problems. They didn't wash their hair. They didn't really take it down because it took so long to put up, and they would kind of glue it in place. So they would get vermin and lice, and they had sticks to help scratch it. Once we started neoclassicism, these go away. These disappear, this idea of powdered hair, again, how the aristocracy inadvertently causes revolution. That they were using flour to powder their hair, and people were starving. So of course we're going to complain about that, or revolute about that. Corsets became a work of art in the 18th century, also called stays, but they were dangerous. They were They were not comfortable. They really were a way to keep women in their place a little bit. So you would have internal damage, fainting. We had the fainting couch because you can't, whenever you're wearing a corset, it constricts the center bit of you, for those of you who have studied any sort of anatomy. Right below the lungs, we have the diaphragm that goes up and down. That kind of helps us breathe. Once you cinch your waist in so much, your diaphragm does not move up and down anymore, has nowhere to go. So you could only breathe very shallowly at the top of your chest. And that is very lovely because heaving breaths is a thing that could be considered attractive. But if you get scared, you could hyperventilate and pass out. It also caused miscarriages because there's nowhere for a baby to grow, and sometimes it would internal damage. They would break ribs. Ribs would jab into internal organs, and it rearranged your body. Corsets were considered a status symbol. They prevented women from overexertion. If you could wear a corset, it indicated that you were a member of the leisure class. Corsets were made out of satin, embroidered silk, and brocade, or they were made out of like plain materials and then decorated with a stomacher. Working women wore a lace-up corselet, so it wasn't as elaborate as it just kind of cinched things together. It was kind of like a proto-bra girdle. And the revolution did away with bone corsets because, again, we want au naturel. There we go. And here is a photo collage of a period, an actual period corset. So you'll notice that it sort of supports the breast. So this would sit underneath or right at the bottom of the breast, supports the breast, and look how it kind of curves around the body. And you would cinch it with eyelets in the string, and it would pull all of you in. And here is an artist's conception of corseting a person. So the stomacher is a decorative inset between the corset and stays and the bodice. These tabs you would either lace into your corset, or you would lace into your dress. And this was an easy way to kind of change styles. So you would have a bunch of different stomachers and not a lot of different corset. You wouldn't have a different corset. Like men's style, anytime a bodice or an overskirt was open in the front, we're gonna decorate it. So the petticoat, whenever we saw it, was highly decorated. The stomacher or the corset itself, whenever we saw it, was highly decorated. So we would have ladder of bows, which is échelles, embroidery or ribbon flowers that would decorate it. And we can kind of see this is embroidery with some decorative lacing in front. Hats, men and women both wore the tricorn hat or the bicorn hat. We also had soft caps, and it would be adorned with lots of different things. So you would have gold braid or big feathers. Yankee Doodle stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni, as we learned from the book where that came from. Women wore a cartwheel hat of straw or felted wool, highly decorated and kind of perched atop the big hair edifice, as we see here. And then we had this sort of this style hat will come back in the 19th century. Don't you worry. Shoes continue to be the same low-heeled style as 17th century and still as decorated and sort of lovely, delicate. And then we also see this sort of low-heeled shoe for men, what we would consider Puritan shoes almost. All right, so men's clothing. The pieces of men's clothing. Underdrawers, which they wore beneath their breeches, made of wool, linen, or cotton. And then we had our shirt. Shirt, again, is still super duper important. You would either have a neckcloth or a cravat or a sort of tied-in piece that would go around your neck. That was sometimes stiff or sometimes soft. Eventually, this turned into an attached collar. You would have, this is stocks, which is this up here. So it's a long tie collar with a little bit of cravat. The waistcoat, the outer coat, sometimes with turned up sleeves, sometimes not. You'll notice we're still decorating the bottoms of our cuffs of our shirts. And then we have tight breeches, knee breeches, and stocking or hose and shoes, and our wig and a hat. And that is what men wore for most of the 17th or the 18th century. It didn't really change much. All that changed was decoration and style and cut, but the three-piece suit sort of stuck around for much of the 1700s. Sometimes all three pieces were made of the same fabric, so you could see here the bit of the waistcoat, breeches, his stockings, and his coat, and that's a long coat. Or sometimes they were made of three contrasting materials, so red breeches, yellow coat, and bluish green outer coat. I know. Suit coats could have huge cuffs, big pocket flaps, and no collar like this guy over here. So the huge cuffs, long, and you see how decorated this is around the thing, and big pocket flaps. Or you could have a little bit of an attached collar, very plain, but you'll notice that a lot of the fabric that sort of hung at the sides has moved to the backside. And so smaller cuffs, slimmer sleeves, and all three the same color. Breeches were baggy in the seat, as we see here, for comfort when horseback riding. A lot of them were also, when you rode horses, they were made out of leather, and leather doesn't stretch kind of at all. So they would have to add extra material back there so you could sit down. And then we had the front flap with buttons that you could open up and take a whiz. Some coats were ornate, some were plain. Later in the 18th century, the outer coat became less important and you didn't button it up. So your waistcoat would get really, really, really decorated, like we see here, that there's not a lot of decoration on the coat itself, but the waistcoat is highly embroidered and beautiful. And we see the super decorated coat here, and waistcoat, and kind of matches her. I think this is a portrait of some sort of royalty. And we see here, again, this sort of varied styles in here. So we have that they don't match, and he has gout. You can tell here this is, I think this is a king with gout because his foot is all wrapped up. And we see sort of an evolution of styles. And this is a pastor back here because he's wearing kind of a black mantle with that double tab collar. And kind of neat. We see the same thing here. I think this is Hans Holbein. And a whole bunch of different styles again. Large cuffs. You see the shirt under, behind the waistcoat. The coat in this one specifically is not meant to close. You'll notice there's not really any buttons on it. And then knee breeches and stockings, stocks. So you can see each of these has a different sort of look to them. A style of a wrap called a greatcoat or a redingote, from riding coat, was worn outdoors. It had a double collar, as you can see here, and buttons to protect the neck. And it was long and had a long skirt and the large cuffs. So it was kind of like another suit coat, but it was made out of outdoor fabric. This sort of coat will come back again and again and again. We're going to see it make its way into female clothing as well. We talked about the banyan earlier. This sort of dressing gown, informal homeware, and I love them. I would lounge in one of them always. The cravat went out, replaced with a stock, which is here, a high wrap neckband with a sort of ruffled jabot that came down the shirt front. Women's clothing. So in women's clothing, so we have the manteau. Remember this? I had this picture in yesterday's lecture. So it was the underskirt and the overskirt. The overskirt was pulled back, or overgown was pulled back, and kind of all the material was put at the butt. and supported with a bustle, which is this is kind of just underpinnings. Underpinnings are the name of the game for the 18th century and the 19th century. That we see a lot of very large changes of female shape, and it's because of the underclothes that she's wearing, and the shape that they give. Sort of like today, if you want to wear a skirt that has more fullness, you might throw a crinoline underneath it, or you might throw another skirt underneath it to help push it out. We don't do that too much, but every once in a while you'll find a dress, you'll buy a dress that has the crinoline, that sort of stiff netted material already stuck to the dress, so it helps you poof it out. Exact same thing, but this one is a little more intense. So we have hooped underpinnings to create bells is one of the shapes that we see. So it would be concentric circles that sort of help billow that out. And this one is even more stiff. This is an empress of some sort. We see the bell shape begin to flatten from the back and widen from side to side. So, and these skirts could be as wide as 6 feet. These are called panniers. So they were either their own sort of straps and metal bits or wicker work baskets, kind of look like baskets that you hang off either hip, or it could be put as part of a skirt. So that of a petticoat would have these built in wicker, and these could be made out of wirework, boning, or steel. Then there were 4 basic different types of gown or dress. So early, again, we have the mantua, an underskirt. So we have an underskirt, and then we have an overgown that sort of matches. You'll see that this woman here has this dress here has a stomacher. That's this other extra piece here, and this the bodice doesn't close to kind of show off that stomacher. A costume more like a modern dress, which is a separate cut bodice and a skirt, and there was a waistline seam. So this is the bodice and then the separate skirt here. You'll notice there's a bit of a train for this. A combination of a jacket and a skirt called the caracal or the cascan. And this is kind of like a pleated robe d'anglais, a robe de français. And so they would wear a skirt with this, and you can kind of see that here. So there's a skirt, and then there's a special jacket on there. And it's kind of built like the men's jacket. So it has cuffs, a little bit of, and it's just shorter. So it's cuffs, and it doesn't close in the front. This is what we called the ladder of bows here. A flowing gown, commonly called a sack, fell freely from the shoulders in both front and back. So you'll notice that there's nothing that kind of sucks, gives shape in here. The women were still wearing corsets. There's still a whole bunch of underpinnings and stuff to give the shape to it. But the overgown itself kind of hung freely from the shoulders. Lots and lots and lots of pleats. So I'll have you guys read this to yourself. This is from the Victoria and Albert Museum. There's lots of fantastic clothing in the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's one of the things they do really, really well. So it's kind of detailing what the sack coat is and how it hangs. Oh, I forgot to tell you this. Go back. So this YouTube video is a woman who is putting on the layers that is part of this sort of dress. So I would suggest you watch it. It's pretty interesting. Bodices fit snugly, and they had sort of pointed waists, a little bit of peplum in the back, and tight sleeves, and then you would have the ruffles would be a separate bit. And they would have different closures depending on what type of bodice it was in. Many gowns had extra fullness in the back. So these are box pleats because they create a sort of square box. And this fullness runs from shoulder to hem. This is the robe à la française. And this is a specific style. And then we have the robe d'anglais that is pleats in the front and the back, and they sort of fill out. So you see this is the back of the skirt, and then you would have more pleats in the front of the skirt. And it just sort of hung from the waist to the floor. And you see how sort of fullness it is. Anytime you think about the American Revolution and Betsy Ross sewing, this is what I think about. This is the type of robe that they were generally, the type of gown they were generally wearing. Some robings. This is folds or strips of fabric here that that edge the front of the gown or the open bodice, and it's just another weird decorative element. And they would have trim or ruching, the sort of balls of fabric, and it was usually the same cut as the gown. You don't necessarily ever see this being a separate color than the rest of the gown. The panniers, this is the stereotypical shape of the age that when we talk about the 18th century, this is the shape that we see. Again, this is about conspicuous leisure, that you have to go through doors sideways, you can't sit, you can't scrub floors, you can't cook dinner, you can't do anything but look beautiful. This sort of clothing is about being free to be wealthy, about being an art piece, about being a creation in and of yourself, and not necessarily linked to anything else. They had a collapsible version as well that you kind of like lifted up and it made you skinnier so you could get through doors. But again, this is, you have your corset, you have a you have a chemise, you have an underskirt, you have the panniers, you have a petticoat over top of it, you have a corset, you have a bodice over top of that, or an undershirt, and then a bodice, and then a stomacher, and then an overskirt, and then maybe another overskirt. So it wasn't all like roses and ruchings for women at this time being objects of art, that it was sort of onerous. There was a lot of stuff you had to do to wear these sorts of clothing. And you would be really uncomfortable doing it. There was no comfort at this time. And here, again, so we see this is sort of, this shape here is made by the panniers in both of these. Again, panniers, and they're bowing to each other with their sort of very delicate, this is like 100% Rococo right here. And here's some more extreme versions of it. Yuck. And some of the underpinnings, the less extreme versions of the underpinnings. So this is the one where it's sewn into a skirt, or sewn into a petticoat, or sewn into an underpinnings. This one here is padded as the shapers. So this is a little bit later. This one has wire or willow work inside. Sleeves were generally loosely fitted to through the elbow and decorated with lots and lots of lace. And then later, long, narrow sleeves become very popular, as we see here. Lots of lace, and then becoming slowly narrower in this one. Marie Antoinette loved to pretend to be country folk. She moved out of Versailles because she really super duper hated French court. She was a transplant from Austria, and she despised the French court and its sort of formality. So she decided that she was going to move out and go to a separate little cottage palace and tend sheep. So she needed something she could tend sheep in. And so this is the sort of look that she came up with. You'll notice that it's coming up off the floor because you don't want poop. But you notice she still has a big old train in the back. And it's a little smidge looser. It doesn't have the sort of wideness to it or the bell shape to it. And here is her again. This is also, we're starting to see some of the neoclassical lines in this as well. That, we saw some of this stuff, this sort of the top ruffle, the looser belt. We saw this in some of our Greek and Roman looks. Another country inspired style is called the polonaise. So this is, you would wear a petticoat and then you would have an over gown that you tucked up. Each of these sort of shapes in here had a string attached to it, so you would put the gown on and then you would pull the string like a shade, and it would just kind of zoop, and you tied it off to the top of your waistband here. And where the fabric hung, it was usually 360, or at least hips and behind. And you'll notice that they put a little ribbon on it. If it was going to stand still, we're going to decorate it. And then we put that sort of robings across the bottom here. And then the bodices were tightly fitted. And you'll notice that we have a little bit of a robe d'anglais here, that sack look here, and also the polonaise look. So they're blending styles together. Towards the end of the century, the profile shrunk again, probably from pressures of materials. There's a lack of materials. There's a lack of people to make the stuff for them. The English style was becoming more and more popular in France, so that Anglicanism became sort of the mode of the later 18th century. They also probably kind of used these styles because it distanced themselves from the aristocracy. When Madame de Guillotine was working, you didn't want to make any sort of movement towards being an aristocracy, being part of the nobility, because you could get your head chopped off. So we're seeing shorter skirts. This is an open gown, but we're going to see closed round gowns, redingote dresses, and the chemise à la Reine. So this is the start of our neoclassical style. Again, whenever I think of colonial times, this is sort of what I think about. So we're starting to see more softer lines, no big underpinnings here. Still, they're wearing lots and lots and lots of fabric, but it's becoming less onerous. So this is 1797 here. And this style remember this style, we're going to see this come back soon. And this is the redingote dress. I think I got this from Victoria and Albert Museum. So it has those tight sleeves and a long bodice and a wide lapel. So this is sort of echoing military wear almost, or echoing the men's greatcoat. Some modern influences. Vivienne Westwood in the 90s really super duper went back to Rococo, went back to the 18th century and brought it forward. So this is one of her corsets, and you can see it on the person, and some of this sort of patterned and trim that was popular from Rococo. Pearls and the hair of Rococo showed up, but isn't that kind of spectacular? Again, Vivienne Westwood in 96. That she's using toile fabric with a little bit of panniers on the hips there, and then Marie Antoinette all over, or Madame de Pompadour all over the place here. But you'll notice she's using very modern fabrics in this. So it's the mantua with the big ruffly sleeves and the petticoat. This is Dior. So of course Vivienne Westwood did it, and then Dior did it as well. So again, we're seeing kind of this sort of largeness and ruffles and bits and pieces, and the hats. Even men's styles, our men's styles didn't really, shape-wise, didn't really change for the last 300, 400 years, but the decoration does. So this looks like the long coat, the outer coat that we saw earlier in the slideshow.